Hi, this is Lex, and welcome to the Fintech Blueprint. It's your podcast about fintech, decentralized finance, digital banking, investing, robo-advice, artificial intelligence, and all the other frontier technology that is transforming financial services. To get more content, like an illustrated transcript of this conversation in your inbox, subscribe at fintechblueprint.com. So without further delay, let's jump into today's episode. Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's conversation. I'm thrilled to have with us today Alain Meier, who is the head of identity at Plaid. And I'm really looking forward to a conversation about the nature of identity entrepreneurship around these themes and where the market is going. Alain, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here. Thanks, Lex.
Let's start with the easiest of questions. What does Plaid do?
You would think that's an easy question, but it has become more complex over time. What everyone has known Plaid as for a number of years now is financial account linking. So, say you go to create a Venmo account, you want to go send money to your friends, you need to link a financial account, like maybe your Bank of America account, to that Venmo so that you can actually fund it. Plaid makes it super, super easy for you to, link that bank account so that you can transfer those funds. That was sort of like the first act of the company. And then I'm part of the second act of the company, which involves additional products like identity verification, which, we'll get into a little bit later, but I think that suffices for now.
Another very easy question. What is identity?
Identity is the hardest one because everybody means something a little bit different when they talk about identity, right? So there's identity from the username, password, login type of, authentication, credentials type of perspective, right? You want to make an account on a website, that kind of identity. But then all the way on the other end of the spectrum is this concept of you are a living, breathing human being. How do you prove that you are who you claim to be? Is it what the government says you are, right? I'm Alain Meier. I'm this age. I live in this country and I'm a citizen. Or is it, the person that you behave as online, which is more of the crypto view of identity, right? We have all these pseudonymous identities that represent personalities or, thoughts, feelings, opinions. And I think, we're kind of seeing this morphing of what identity means on the internet over time.
To me, there's something really reflective about identity in the sense that, you know who you are and you know what you're doing. And most of the time, you don't need to be reminded of it because you're acting as such. Rather, others require proof that you are you, or others require proof that the chain of history of what you've done sort of meets some particular requirement, i.e., you haven't done lots and lots of crimes, and therefore you should be able to open a bank account. So there's something fuzzy about it because it's almost like your reflection rather than you in particular. Can you talk about maybe your earlier entrepreneurial experiences related to identity and what kinds of insights drove you to start a company in the space?
So when we got started with the company, I actually had no background in identity whatsoever. Kind of rewinding a little bit, I was super into Bitcoin. I was at university at the time. This is around 2013. And I met this guy who was my pre-major advisor called Balaji Srinivasan, who is pretty well known now on the crypto Twitter type of sphere. And he had this budding interest in Bitcoin. I had this budding interest in Bitcoin. And we said, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we started sort of like the first higher education research group into crypto? So we started this thing called the Stanford Bitcoin Group. And there were a whole bunch of us who were part of this class that Balaji was teaching called Startup Engineering. And it basically was just kind of a self-selecting group of people who were all interested in building projects and, had picked up programming at a young age in a self-directed way. All of us, I don't know if you know anything about Balaji, but if you do, he goes on these really long, I'll call them rants about his visions for the world and where it's going and where it should be. He would do those during these hackathons for that startup engineering class. And a group of us would just stay all together hacking until 3, 4, 5 a.m. And we had a blast. And all of those people ended up becoming part of this Stanford Bitcoin Group, where we worked on a whole bunch of different projects together. And one of the projects that I worked on with a guy called John Backus was this Bitcoin remittance system. So our theory was basically that, crypto is obviously an extremely efficient way of transmitting money. And especially it could be very helpful when sending money back home for remittances, right? Say maybe you grew up in China, you go to the US, you make some money, you want to send money back to your parents. So we kind of worked on that for a little bit. And long story short, it was way too early for Bitcoin. There weren't enough fiat on and off ramps at the time to actually make it an efficient way to remit money. I think it's a much better solution now, but at the time it wasn't. But while building that remittance software, we of course had to build a lot of identity, anti-fraud tech, both to comply with regulations, but then also just to kind of secure that actual platform. So in a last ditch attempt, we bundled up that software and then we went to Reddit. We actually went to r/Bitcoin and we put up a post that said something like, I want to help Bitcoin companies with KYC compliance. Because I think what people forget about is that in 2013, it was actually a little bit contentious that you had to do about whether or not you had to do KYC for cryptocurrencies at all. Many people argued that crypto is this new world. It's not actual money. And so you don't have to comply with all these rules and regulations. So there were a lot of companies who were letting you buy crypto with fiat money without actually doing any type of KYC. So we kind of came from it from a different angle and said, look, if we want crypto to be mainstream, if we want Bitcoin to be mainstream, people never called it crypto back then. It was always just Bitcoin. If we want Bitcoin to be mainstream, then we need to help the industry make it as not burdensome as possible to actually comply with these rules and regulations, and also to reduce the fraud, right? Because crypto does it encourages a lot of people to try to defraud them because of the irreversibility of those transactions. We put up our Bitcoin post, and it went, I wouldn't call it viral, but we got a decent number of upvotes at the time. And we had an email wait list where we had, Brian Armstrong and Fred Ersham and all these early crypto people signing up to be interested. So we thought, okay, cool. There's something potentially here. We eventually launched it. And of course, one of the early people was Coinbase. And so John and I were in the South Bay in San Francisco. And then we took the train up to SF to meet with Brian Armstrong and Coinbase to pitch them this product. And we go up there, we take the train, we're super, super excited. And we get to the Coinbase office, which at the time was, it was a small apartment in SF. And I think there were maybe 10 people in the office, something like that. And we pitched this product to them, this KYC product. We finished the demo. And then Fred Ersham is basically like, what the hell is this, guys? Like, this is garbage. This is like, how do you do this? What about this? What about that? Because we didn't have that background in identity, we got absolutely torn to shreds. After that, we packed up our things. We said, thank you very much. We went back down to the South Bay and we spent the next 6 months, I'd say, talking to as many customers as we possibly could and just completely rewriting this product to be what we thought was significantly better. And, we hit up Fred Ersham again, said, hey, I know that, you didn't love the product last time, but we've been working hard. Can we demo it to you again? So we go up there, we demo it for a bunch of their compliance folk. It was 6 months later. So they had actually already grown pretty considerably. And we finished the demo, and on the spot, the compliance folk are like, this is amazing. We have to have this right now. So they were one of our early customers that showed us that there was actually potentially something here. That was kind of like the original start.
Gotcha. Amazing stuff. Seeing Coinbase in the early days, I'm sure was fascinating. Did you stay integrated into the Coinbase stack? Like, were you their full onboarding solution? And then how did the product evolve?
Yeah. So at the time, I don't know how much you or the listeners know about KYC, but now the current en vogue is that every provider tries to provide every aspect of KYC or identity verification. But back in the day, there was just a whole bunch of different specific vendors that handled different components of different sorts of checks. We were handling for them at the time, and we still do, a large portion of their watch list checks. So we're still part of that stack today, but we didn't form kind of like that sort of the full stack onboarding component of it like we do today. Now it's more of like come work with us, and we've figured out all of the different components, soup to nuts for you, so that you don't need to cobble together an ID verification software, even though that's not your core competency.
What does that platform look like, right? You've been building this previous company, Cognito, for almost 9 years before it was acquired by Plaid. During those 9 years, how has that platform evolved? Like, what are the different tentacles? And maybe part of that is also like not just the value proposition, but from a build perspective, what did you make? What is the technology that you've put together?
At first, which was this very, very early version that we were demoing for Coinbase, we had built the theory was essentially we wanted to just make easier developer APIs for existing ID verification software. So what does that mean? It means an API endpoint where you send it your name, your date of birth, your address, your social security number, and then we validate that data against government records, credit bureau records, whatever's out there, whatever we can get our hands on, we try to verify that information. And then secondarily to that, there's sort of two aspects to ID verification. There's the verification component, which is what I just described, where you validate data and make sure that it's correct. That's my SSN, so on and so forth. And then there's authentication, which is making sure that I didn't just take, your PII and enter it into someone else's sign-up form. So at that point in time, the way that a lot of people did the authentication component was this thing called knowledge-based authentication. And knowledge-based authentication, I'm sure you've been through this before, it's that thing that says, what color was your car that you drove in, or, what color was your Toyota Camry in 2008? Or, which of these lenders did you take out a mortgage with? That worked well in the early days of the internet, but then by the time we had released that original product, it was starting to be on its last legs. And we saw that there were more people who were fraudsters who were able to accurately answer those questions than there were real people. Because real people have fallible memory, but fraudsters could just go and buy the answers from your credit header files or your credit files on the dark web. At that point, we thought, okay, this is okay for companies who are just getting started. We say we have easier APIs, easier commercials, and we saw reasonable success there. I think we got to our first $1 million in revenue with that product, but it was a grind. And I remember thinking at the time, just, before we started the company, I was like, if we get to $1 million in revenue, we've made it. Like, it's done at that point. We can just scale it as much as we want. But the reality was we got to $1 million. It was a grind over like 2 years, and it just didn't feel right. We were like, is this really what it feels like to have a successful company? The answer was no. So we kind of went back to the drawing board at that point. One of the things that's sort of interesting is when you have a whole team of people who are working towards this one vision that you've been pushing and selling really hard, it's actually quite hard sometimes to convince people that they should work on something that's different from that. So what we had to do at the time, so that we didn't distract people or, make them fearful for the future, is even though we were a tiny company, we actually started kind of like a skunkworks project that was just a group of 3 of us in the company who just made a completely new version of the product. We just rewrote it from the ground up. There was a lot of legacy, even though it had only been 2 years. Remember that my co-founder and I, we were like 19 when we dropped out of Stanford. So, we could build things, but we definitely weren't the pinnacle of engineering at the time. So we got a lot better, and we decided, okay, let's just completely rewrite the stack, which rarely works in software, but we decided to do it anyway. And there was this nugget of an idea that we had, which was that, and it may not sound novel today, but at the time it was still pretty novel. It was essentially in 2016, phone numbers are becoming the center of everybody's lives, right? Previously, social security numbers were the number that were just your identifier, right? If you want to be one person in the United States and cleanly say, I am this person, you'd give your social security number. But what was happening around that time, and still is happening, was a bunch of data breaches. So you'd have all of that data, pushed out to the web, and then anybody could enter that data. So we thought, what's a better unique identifier? It's that phone number. It's a global, consistent number that everybody in the world has, basically, right? It's like 90+% of the world has some kind of a phone number. So it's a fantastic universal one to use. And also it's authenticatable. right? You're able to, like an SMS passcode or a silent network authentication with the carrier, you're able to authenticate possession of that phone number. So if we're able to attach your phone number to your traditional identity, that name, date of birth, address, SSN, then we can both verify and authenticate the user extremely, extremely securely and easily. So that was kind of the base idea. And we just collected as much data as we could to link that person's identity to that phone number. So we put that out into the market. We informed the rest of the team that we'd built this thing. Everybody's jaw dropped. They're like, what the hell? And you guys built this internally? And in retrospect, it was a little bit weird that we did that, considering it wasn't a huge team. I think, we were like 10 people and we took like 3 people and just didn't tell the sales guys that we were doing this. We got it out into the market. And then within 6 months, I want to say, we had already reached $1 million in revenue. And we were like, okay, this is what product market fit feels like. And it completely reshaped how I thought about products from that point onward. I think the first go around, I was very much of this impression that, we just haven't nailed the go-to-market motion enough. Like, I just need to train the salespeople better so they can sell the product better. Oh, we just need better marketing materials. Oh, we just need more people to know about us. But it turned out that we were getting in front of plenty of companies, but the original product offering that we had just wasn't good enough yet. And we had to, make something that was actually a little bit sticky for people. So, that was kind of an interesting place to be. And then that original product, which we then called Cognito, the first version of the product was called BlockScore. So a lot of people in crypto actually know us as BlockScore. We wrote out that Cognito product for quite a while. And then over time, we kind of witnessed this phenomenon that I was telling you about earlier, which is identity verification started in a world where one signal was actually plenty to get started. So our companies that worked with us were super happy with just those phone number based ID verification APIs. And then over time, what we saw is the fraud became more aggressive, and companies had to then implement more and more different anti-fraud solutions in order to sufficiently fight that fraud, and then also to keep up with the user experience requirements that people had.
Could I ask you to open up the definition of like fraud and the types of attack vectors that companies started to experience? And I guess just to clarify, like, is your client base at this stage largely crypto exchanges, or are you now working with like lots of different fintechs? And then the actors that are trying to perpetrate fraud, like, what is it that they're doing? How are they trying to break the system?
So now crypto is a minority of our customer base, maybe 20-ish% of revenue. It used to be maybe 80%, but we diversified over time into broader fintech. So I'd consider us more of a broader fintech KYC platform now. In terms of the fraud that we see, it really depends on the application, but we see everything from people trying to fake driver's licenses. There's already a spectrum of that. There's really crappy, made online driver's licenses, all the way up to, crime ring level quality reproductions of driver's licenses, which can be, reasonably good. We also see people trying to spoof what we call the liveness detection, which is essentially like a selfie that makes sure that the person who's presenting an ID is the person who is actually on the ID. We see people who make synthetic masks. We see them, print out Facebook photos that they found of people that they then try to hold up to the camera and move around so that they can follow the prompts on screen. We see synthetic identity verification attacks, which is basically where you manipulate the credit bureau system to inject false identities that never existed, that are modified versions of real people. So they've essentially skewed those records over time so that they can verify themselves what looks like legitimately, but it's really not. We see people who are doing good old fashioned, data theft. They go on the black market, they buy 1,000 identities, and then they try them one after another. I'd say that that's probably the most common. And then also we see, and this one's actually much harder to catch. It's not something that we currently cover as much as that first party fraud, which means you're actually not pretending to be someone else. You're actually saying that you're Alan, but you just go ahead and commit fraud anyway, and then say, oh, but it wasn't me who did that, right? Someone stole my identity. That's a tough nut to crack.
Just makes me think of how much of a pain generative AI is going to be for anything that's trying to figure out if the person's there or not. So another naive question on that is like, so people are trying to defraud the sign-up system or the authentication system. Why are they doing that? What are they trying to get done? Like, what are their goals for trying to break stuff? Like, is it more that there's a crime syndicate and they're trying to wash money through something, and so there's a concerted effort? I guess, what's the end goal of breaking through the system?
It's almost always one of two things. It's either to make money or it's to clean money. Make money is obvious. There, you want to defraud some fintech so that you're able to get money that for them is irreversible and you're able to keep it and use it. And on the other side is cleaning money, which is, they've made money from some likely illegal means, and then they want to get it into your fintech and then have you get the money back out again. And then they can legitimately or seemingly legitimately claim that they made that money by going to X fintech, for instance. So we see both kinds.
And how did that transition of customers happen? You said once you've had the phone-based authentication, it started to really open up the market for you. Did it change the types of customers you had, or did you start adding features to the platform that fintechs prioritized? Like, how did you continue to grow?
The phone number-based authentication was wildly popular in crypto, both because it reduced that friction, because you were able to not ask people these intrusive questions that honestly are a little bit creepy sometimes with that knowledge-based authentication. But then also because of the authentication component, which was that we were able to make those transactions more secure. So that was an instant way that we were able to grow it within the crypto space in general. And then another thing that we were able to do was add in additional products. So we added in watchlist screening, which is basically, governments around the world, they put out these lists of people that you're just not allowed to do business with. And it sounds very easy on the surface. It's actually a very difficult problem because the governments aren't exactly known for putting out the cleanest sets of data that are, hyper normalized and easy to screen against. So there's a lot of ad hoc work that's required to clean up that data and expose as many of those fields that sometimes they just drop them in a text box, right? It's just one single blob of text. It's like, this is their date of birth. Here are the places that they were last seen, in a completely different handwritten, well, I should say manually typed way for every single person. So we normalize that data, put it into a great search pipeline, and then make it super easy for those fintechs to comply with those anti-money laundering regulations. And then when we came out with that product, that helped us get into the fintech segment because that was still kind of a pain point for people. A lot of the solutions out there weren't very tech forward. A lot of them had rolled their own search mechanisms rather than using sort of the more well-known tech like Elasticsearch that, just are much faster than some of the legacy search tech that people were using before.
Clearly you've continued to grow and were acquired by Plaid and now operating from the perspective of being in Plaid. Can you talk about any, evolution or any changes that you're thinking about as it relates to your product? Like, what has the impact been in terms of getting introduced to the Plaid customer base, and what kinds of things have reflected back into your product working at that scale?
I think in the same way that we saw a transition from these single point verification solutions to, many, many checks in order to fight fraud, we're now seeing this new shift in the space that's going from just looking at the ID verification stage of that user onboarding journey to saying there's only so much intel and data that you can get out of someone during the onboarding. You need to look beyond that. So joining Plaid has helped us get more in tune with the verification lifecycle for that customer through the full onboarding. So not just when they're providing that PII, but also when they're doing things like linking their accounts or when they're actually transferring money into their accounts. So by leveraging the data that we're seeing across that entire user onboarding journey, we can make the ID verification stage better in and of itself. And that's a pretty interesting one that we definitely would not have been able to do before Plaid and honestly, a lot of competitors will just simply be unable to do because they're never going to get into things like account linking. They're never going to get into account funding, but we we are. And yeah, I guess, that's mainly what changed on the product side. From a scale perspective, I think I became decently good at working with a sales team of, 3 people, but it's been an entirely different animal to be like, we have hundreds of salespeople and, they have many different priorities. They have many different things that they can offer to our customers to solve their problems. So I think a big thing that I've been having to learn and getting significantly better at is how can you enable that army of salespeople to understand this new product that was originally arguably outside of Plaid's core competency and, make them world-class salespeople so that they can actually help our customers and understand when they should be using this product. And that's been a really tough one. But I'd say we've been reasonably successful at this point. We have 4 in 10 as of last month. 4 in 10 of those new sales actually has ID verification on it as well now, which is crazy. It's been less than a year, but now, 4 in 10 of those Plaid sales that have one of our core products called Auth on it as well also have ID verification.
I can imagine the ease of integration that a company would really value, being able to combine all the different parts and the checks of the onboarding flow, right? So if you imagine a customer interacting with a fintech experience and expecting either budgeting features or personal financial management features or credit underwriting proposals or things of that nature, where they're sharing their information about their real bank accounts, having that additional check of KYC and identity as part of that flow makes perfect sense. And it's a huge pain point for companies to create onboarding flows that don't connect all together. So I think, it's not a surprise that it seems to be working. Meanwhile, you've also been actively interested in the crypto ecosystem. And I wanted to ask you more broadly about identity as you see it developing, outside of this definition of this kind of banking definition of know your customer. What do you think are the other vectors of building out an identity, and what kinds of projects out there, generally speaking, do you find compelling in starting to capture those elements?
I don't know if you or anyone listening knows about verifiable credentials much, but that's kind of been a relative buzzword for the last few years. There's a lot of interesting stuff there. The idea behind a verifiable credential is instead of, for instance, sharing your underlying PII with everyone and saying, here's my name, date of birth, address, instead, you would work with some kind of attester, some organization, person, entity that vouches for an aspect of your identity. And they, make a cryptographic proof that says, at this day, on this time, I verified this aspect of someone's identity. And so rather than needing to collect that raw PII, you're able to instead look at that cryptographic proof, see that it hasn't been tampered with, and that it was in fact this organization who vouched for this component, and theoretically, engage in commerce with them or whatever you were looking to do without ever knowing anything else about that person. You could make a credential about someone's age, for instance. Instead of needing to tell someone your date of birth, you could have a credential that says, at this day on this time, I was at least 18 or I was at least 21. I think that's really interesting, but right now isn't super supported by government regulations. Right now in the United States, if you want to open any type of financial account, the rules and regs say that you have to share that underlying PII. Even if Bank of America issued this verifiable credential to say we verified this person, that would not be enough for you to then sign up for a Chase account or any other fintech or any fintech for that matter. So there's still a ways to go there, but it is very promising technology. And that's my hope that eventually we get more towards a world where that's possible. That being said, it doesn't mean that it can't be used for what I would consider more trust and safety use cases, which are, it doesn't have KYC or regulatory requirements, but, if you're going to create an account on, a ride sharing platform or, a marketplace like Airbnb, they don't have that same regulatory requirement. They just want to make sure that that person is who they claim to be. So verifiable credentials could work really well there. In terms of interesting technology and kind of getting to what you were talking about earlier with generative AI, this one depending on your perspective, could be either very good or very dystopian, which is WorldCoin. Essentially, the idea behind them is they want to provide a proof of humanity. So as we're getting more towards this world where the line is blurred between, is this chatbot passing the Turing test or not? Is this an actual AGI that we're able to converse with? We need some kind of proof that this person is actually a human and not, some kind of LLM sitting on some server somewhere. So the idea behind WorldCoin is they're trying to scan everybody's irises in the world and create basically a crypto wallet for them that has that iris scan component attached to it. The idea being that then you're able to actually prove that you're a human being. I think it's really interesting. I don't know if it's the only possible approach there, but they weighed the trade-offs, and it's definitely one to watch.
It's amazing to me that in this world where we move around and create this enormous amount of digital exhaust that tells the world everything that we're doing on the internet, that still the way to self-identify is to signal a number in a government database. I mean, it's almost appalling, where I feel like our whole selves can be rendered out of the behaviors and instances and consumption and intents into almost a virtual avatar and then modeled out to go and do things for us. What's the best case? Like, what's the most futuristic case that you can see of the digital world spilling out into the physical world? If you look back a couple of years, there are lots of things about biometrics and how, just scanning your thumbnail or, as with WorldCoin, your eyeball, and a variety of other things that popped up in Chinese e-commerce. Like, there was just this trend of biometrics and your body is your identity, and why would you have these abstractions that are just numbers in a database? Where do you think this ends up? Where does it go if the futurists are right?
Well, I think one thing that's underexplored is this idea that, okay, sure, say we have this world where WorldCoin is the de facto standard for, proving your humanity, right? Everyone's irises have been scanned, and that's just how people accept it. Well, what happens in a world where then you authorize a purpose-built LLM that is trained on your emails, your text messages, your chat records, is then permissions to use your iris information, right? And then you're able to theoretically authenticate yourself as an LLM on all these different platforms, but they think that it's you. So it slightly defeats the purpose of those kinds of checks. And I think we're going to see a lot of that, right? We already saw it during the COVID pandemic where people were getting multiple jobs, right? They wanted to make more money. They thought employers won't even notice. So they got 3 programming jobs. They were pulling in, 150, 200, 250K from each of those jobs. Well, what happens if you're able to then, expand out the amount of work that you're able to do by handing it to an LLM to do that work? And for all intents and purposes, it looks like it's you, right? And there's no way to prove that it's not you because you're using that world standard. So I think that we're going to see people pushing the envelope in those ways. And a lot of things are money motivated. So I think in this case, following the money is a very reasonable thing to do.
Some of that is definitely going to take quite a bit of time and quite a bit of technology development, especially as these technologies get squeezed into very thin onboarding experiences, which, like you said before, are a race between the two different sides, one to trick the system and then the other to make the system more anti-fragile. Well, this has been a really fascinating conversation around identity. Is there anything you can tell us about Plaid and about Plaid's growth plans and then potential areas of expansion or areas of success? Of course, the data aggregation chassis is really powerful, and the potential of that data aggregation to power up payments networks is really interesting to many people. The potential of it to anchor identity and sort of financial human authority is also quite interesting. How do you see Plaid as a broader organization evolving in a world where it continues to be an independent company, where the payment networks are also starting to be really interested in the types of things that data aggregation companies do? Like, what are the vectors of competition ahead of the company overall?
Yeah, so I can give you a peek into this, which is, I think what a lot of people don't realize is one of Plaid's core competencies is not just the account linking. It's not just the ID verification. One of its main values is actually the network of fintechs that we work with, right? We work with banks, we work with fintechs, we work with end users. And Plaid kind of sits in the middle of all of that. And to date, we haven't really leveraged network effects that much. But if you imagine a world where we do, there's actually a really interesting stuff that we can do with anti-fraud, with onboarding and identity. So for us looking forward, I think that's one of the main things that we're, looking to show the world that Plaid can do some really interesting things with.
I look forward to seeing it. Well, it's been wonderful to have you on the podcast. And if our audience wants to learn more about you or about the identity offering or Plaid, where should they go?
For the product, definitely go to plaid.com. Follow us at Plaid on Twitter. We post a lot about identity, financial account linking, all that good stuff. And you can follow me on Twitter. My handle is @Alain, spelled ALAIN.
Alain, fantastic. Thank you so much for the conversation today.
Yeah, you too. Thanks for having me.
Hi, everyone. That's it for this week's episode of the Fintech Blueprint. For more technical deep dives into all things fintech and decentralized finance, check out fintechblueprint.com and grab a free subscription to the newsletter. This is Lex, and I'll see you next time.